Hello, and welcome to School to Homeschool. My name is Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of 6, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom. I have kids in their 20s, all the way down to elementary age, and everything in between. Are you thinking about pulling your kids from the public school system like I did, but you are scared to death and don't know what to do next? My friends, I felt the exact same way. And you have come to the right place. I want to help your family leave the system so that you can take the hearts and minds of your children back. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Adam Andrews. Now, Adam and his wife, Missy, are the parents of 6 children and 3 grandchildren. Their youngest is in graduate school. And in 2003, they created the centerforlit.com, which is a fabulous resource for teachers and parents to support in reading comprehension and literature. And my friends, I'm so excited to introduce you to Adam because he brings such a rich world of experience and help and support for you and I to teach our children literacy and help them along the way in their education. So, Adam, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Janae.
So let's start with, how did you come up with the Center for Lit? You homeschooled all of your kids.
We did.
Okay, so then let's talk about the Center for Lit and how you came up with that and all that good stuff, the history of it.
Sure. Well, Missy and I got sort of a literary education in college, and we were bookworms, both of us. And as our house started to fill up with children when we were young married people, we started looking around for curriculum materials that would help us give that literary education to them as well. And we were a little disappointed in what we found. It always seemed like the curriculum materials that were out there sort of assumed a school administration in the background, some people that you could be answerable to and that would really take all the responsibility off of the shoulders of the teacher, and the teacher would basically just be delivering something that she had been handed. Since we wanted to be homeschoolers and to sort of do it ourselves, we felt that a lot more support was necessary. And not just in terms of logistics and curriculum, but also a sense of psychological support, that we wanted to be encouraged that we could actually pull this off outside of the boundaries of a traditional school administration and organization. So we started developing these kinds of curriculum materials ourselves in the subjects of reading comprehension and literature, so as to provide ourselves with that sense of encouragement and then also spread it to other people. And that became pretty popular in the early 2000s. And we've been doing it now for 21 years. Basically, not only providing, as I said, the tools in the classroom that help a teacher lead a good discussion of a work of literature, show her students how to think clearly about literature and reading, but also feel like she has the privilege and the authority and the right to stand there and do that and be encouraged kind of on the back end about the fact that this is going to go just fine. So we've been doing that for about 21 years with various sets of resources.
I love that. And the Center for Lit has a number of really fantastic resources on your website, which I'm going to put in the show notes for parents to look at. So let's start at the beginning. How do we effectively teach our kids literature, which is a very loaded question?
Sure it is. Well, a couple of simple questions to start with. The first one is for you, the teacher, to have a clear idea in mind. What is the difference between a novel and a newspaper? That's a really good place to start. Or what is the difference between a novel and a menu in a restaurant? And if you think about it for a minute, it's not that they use different words, because they use the same words. They're both written in English. It's the organization of the words on the page, or in other words, the structure of the writing that you're looking at, right? Where do the appetizers go on the menu? They go at the top. Where do desserts go? At the bottom. That's how you know it's a menu, right? It turns out that when we're reading a work of literature, it has similar features. There are structural elements of a novel, for example, that repeat themselves every time. Where is the exposition of a novel? It's in the beginning. Where's the climactic moment? It's at a place where the underlying conflict of the story is resolved. You can think about a work of literature structurally in the same way that you think about a menu structurally, and you'll notice an amazing thing. All novels have the same structure. And this is a really powerful idea because it means that very, very simple stories that you're reading with your 5-year-old have essentially the same structure as Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And if you can teach him the structure when he's 5, and by the way, it's way simpler than you think, then by the time it's time to read Shakespeare and Dickens and Twain and Dostoevsky, he will be prepared because he will be familiar with the kind of work that he is reading, having read that kind of work since his kindergarten year. So the first thing we do with parents is we say, recognize the structure of a work of literature. Now, the structure of a work of literature is made up of recognizable things: protagonist, character; conflict, problem; plot, sequence of events, which includes things like exposition, rising action, climactic moment, falling action, conclusion. Pretty simple concepts that we can show you how to string together and understand, and then pass on that understanding to kids so that they are always reading not just a story that comes to them through their emotions, but also a work of art that they recognize the shape of. And that puts them in, even at an early age, in conversation with the artist. And that's the essential habit of good reading that leads to literary education, leads to reading comprehension, leads to all of the good outcomes that we're hoping for.
I love that. So how do we start? Okay, so when we start with our littles, what's the best way, as little children, should we be pointing out the protagonist, the antagonist, the storyline, the plot? What would you suggest as we're reading with our kids? What do we need to do?
So first of all, we need to read with our kids as much as possible. And we need to do it in a low pressure environment where we're reading for enjoyment. Mm-hmm. And if we're reading, A Bargain for Francis by Russell Hoban, about the two badgers who can't get along, first thing we do is we read so that everybody enjoys the story and they chuckle at the right parts and they learn the story's lesson at the end, and it's wonderful. And we do that as often as we can without the hint of school over the top of it. But every once in a while, we ask our students, who is this story about? Is this story about Francis the badger who wants the blue tea set? Or is it about Thelma, her friend, who wants to keep it from her? And we have a very simple conversation that identifies subtly, maybe even so the student doesn't notice, the concept of protagonist. And eventually we say, the person that a story is about is called the protagonist. Can you say protagonist? And then without any trouble, the concept of protagonist has been solidified and learned, and we can take that into the next discussion. Maybe the next discussion, after several dozen books where we read together and don't have any school at all, is about conflict. What's the problem in this story? What does Frances want? Why can't she have it? What stands in her way? And subtly we introduce the next level of literary analysis, if you want to call it that, protagonist striving for goal over obstacle, which I just have to remind you is in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky too, just as clearly. And so we begin, not every time, not in a pressure way, not in a hurry. As the situation or the opportunity presents itself, we present the basic building blocks of literary reading to even our youngest kids at a level they can understand.
I love that. Now, I have several parents who've pulled their kids in middle school and high school. And I hear again and again and again, like, my child doesn't like to read. They don't like books. They don't. What do they do? What do those parents do to help their children come to love literature who might have a really bad taste in their mouth from school? What can they do?
Well, what we've found over 20 years of doing this is that the overwhelming majority of kids who say, I don't like literature, mean a single thing. And that thing is, I don't understand it. It's presented to me as some sort of secret. The meaning of a story is some sort of secret that I don't know, and that the smart guy up in front of the room appears to know, and he's not really explaining it to me. And I have to guess. And so it's a huge mystery. It's shrouded in failure and bad guesses and D-minuses, and I hate it. And we found that the best, they always mean that when they say, I don't like literature. And we found that the best way to turn them from haters into lovers is to explain it to them. It's actually not a mystery. Every novel has a protagonist striving for a goal. Let's talk about the protagonist of this story. Every novelist, when he goes to write a novel, is trying to communicate. The protagonist striving for the goal. He's actually trying to be understood. He's not trying to tell a secret. And so the best way to turn a kid who doesn't like literature into one who does is to make it clear what literature is shaped like. The other thing we always do with kids in that situation is we say, I wonder if the books you've been reading are too hard. Let's try an easy one. And we always work with books way below reading level in order to teach the basic principles of literary reading. That book I referenced a minute ago about A Bargain for Francis, about the two badgers who can't get along. We use that story, which, by the way, is a step into reading book level 2, where none of the words are longer than 3 syllables. We use that story with our high school students all the time. And at the beginning of the class, they look at us like, what are you doing? That's a kid's book, as if that's an argument for something. And by the end of the class, they realize, oh, wait a minute. This is protagonist striving for goal over obstacle. I get it. I bet I could try Shakespeare now. And so using easy stories below reading level, combined with a commitment to laying out before students the structure common to every story in the world, is a really great combination for overcoming this hatred of literature.
I love that. Now, what about the struggling readers, where maybe they would like literature, but the reading piece is a struggle for them?
The decoding, the phonics piece, is that what you mean?
The phonics, the decoding,
Sure.
The reading comprehension, because they've spent so much time doing the decoding and then they, putting it all together. What do we do for those kids?
The easiest story in the world is the solution to that problem, in my view. A story that is not threatening to a particular student because he is familiar with all the words and doesn't have to spend his time decoding. So you go back all the way to the very beginning. The world's simplest story is the place to start. And the student's age is really irrelevant to this question. His ability to work in the world of decoded words is really the telling detail. You've got to work with kids on a story that is already decoded in their own mind. But as long as you can do that, then you can have success and move incrementally up to the next most difficult story. Again, regardless of his age, but that's appropriate to his phonetic ability.
So, for example, you might suggest like, okay, this student really struggles reading. He's a 9th grade student. And really, he's probably reading at a 4th grade level, going back to a story that he's already read, already familiar with, and starting from there.
Absolutely. So if he's reading at a 4th grade level, giving him a book at a 6th grade level is a cruel insult. That's a terrible thing to do for a kid reading at a 4th grade level. Give him a book at a 4th grade level and work on it. And say, all right, here's a book at your reading level. And what we're going to do is learn how to read not just this book, but we're going to learn today how to read every book ever written by using one of the books at your reading level as our tool. And this only works if we understand that book at the 4th grade level is more or less the same structurally as every other novel in the world. Well, once we realize that, it sets us free from being bound to a grade level. What we can do instead is aim at the student's reading level and work with him there.
I love it. I love it. Now, with your kids, what would your day look like as you were raising your kids when it came to literature?
Well, that would be a better question for my wife, who did most of the work in the trenches every day. But I know 2 things that were always present in our schedule. And the first one was relationally oriented reading aloud, where the littlest ones would sit next to her on the couch and they'd go through stacks and stacks of picture books. Again, as I said a few minutes ago, not necessarily with any scholastic or academic goal in mind, but just to create an atmosphere where reading was enjoyable and relationally oriented and welcome in the day. And then at intervals, not necessarily every day, we actually used a kind of a college schedule in our homeschool where we met classes once a week or twice a week, and in between did life and quiet reading and that sort of stuff. But every once in a while we get together and say, okay, here are the books we've been reading. Let's have what we call a Socratic discussion about them. And what we used to mean by the word Socratic is let's have a discussion where we ask questions together rather than me standing up and lecturing to you about the meaning of it all. And those questions would always center around the structural elements of a story. Who is the protagonist? What's he trying to get? Why can't he have it? At what moment in the story do we find out the answer to this question? And we use the same questions every time so that over the years, our kids recognized the questions. They were familiar with the questions. They even saw the questions coming. Oh, it's literature time. Mom's going to ask who the protagonist is. I know she always does, right? And so without the students even knowing it, we were teaching them how to ask the right questions of the books they would someday read without us. So we had, so please go ahead.
I was going to say, what was the benefit of asking Socratic questions and having that kind of a discussion?
Well, the benefits are many. First of all, it took the burden off of our shoulders to be the expert in everything, right? I don't have to be an expert in Dostoevsky to ask the same questions of Dostoevsky that I've been asking since you were little of A Bargain for Francis. All I need to know are the questions. So it's a great benefit to the teacher who may be doing a bunch of other subjects too, and may also doubt her ability or her experience or her qualifications to actually be doing this. Right? I mean, it seems like there's two models of teaching that we can take into this project. And one we inherit from our culture and from the educational establishment, which is it takes a certified expert to effectively teach anything. And the other model is it takes a astute questioner to learn anything. And the teacher is the primary learner in a classroom. And excuse me, I assure you that this second model of teaching is every bit as effective and even has a longer history than the first model. And that model is can really be encouraging to teachers who are thinking about homeschooling for the first time. The second benefit that this Socratic questioning model has is that the students learn not just what the answers are, but they learn how to ask the questions themselves. And this is really the mark of a good reader, coming to the voice of a stranger, an author that he or she has never read, and learning how to listen, learning how to ask questions rather than give answers, to let the author say what he wants to say and not interrupt. A Socratic method is really the best for teaching that habit of mind.
I love that. And I'm assuming the Socratic method came from Socrates, correct?
Sure. We get its name from Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher who was famous for professing to know nothing and only to ask his students questions. And we don't use it in a technical sense. We just mean teach by asking questions. But really, there is sort of a philosophical benefit there. You don't have to be an expert. You can profess not to really even know. I've never read Dostoevsky. We're going to try it together. We're going to ask familiar questions that I believe will open it up for us. But I'm not sitting up here professing to know anything necessarily. We're very, very freeing. I
love that. So examples of some Socratic questions parents can ask as they're reading with their kids.
Okay, great. So one of the main structural elements of the story, of every story, is setting. Every story happens at a particular time, in a particular place, among particular kinds of people, at a particular moment in the main character's life, for example, right? So you can ask a set of questions about the setting of the story that will focus the student's attention on that element and get them thinking about what it means. For example, for your very youngest students, does this story happen in the country or the city? Very simple. And if the student is reading The City Mouse and the Country Mouse, he might say, it happens in both places, right? Part of the story happens in the country, part of the story happens in the city. The teacher could follow that up with a second question. Do you think that's important, that this story happens in the country and the city? What are the differences between the country and the city? And as the student begins to haul out details from the story to illustrate the differences, the teacher might ask, is the author trying to tell us something? How do these differences affect the relationship between the two mice? And we can use setting in this way by asking the students questions about the setting to get all the way to one of the author's main themes, which is the similarities between us are more important than the differences.
I love that.
Right? However, that very same question, does this story happen in the country or the city, can be asked of any story, even stories written for adults, with very different results. For example, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Does this story happen in the country or the city? An astute reader might notice that the major action of this story happens on the Mississippi River, separated in a very profound way from all of the civilized towns up and down the banks. And there is a great separation between the city, represented by the towns, the civilization on the banks, and the country, the freedom and the uncivilized freedom of the Mississippi River, which is one of Twain's most important ways to say the city and the civilization of this country is corrupt and is characterized by bondage and hypocrisy. And where we find real freedom is away from town, out on the raft. And Twain says at one amazing point in his novel, there's no freedom like the freedom on a raft. And this question about the setting, where does this story happen, is profoundly thematic with respect to Huckleberry Finn. Now, a 5-year-old would never get that, because a 5-year-old would never be reading Huckleberry Finn. But the same simple question about the setting of the story, the Socratic question we would call it, is productive on both ends of the curriculum, kindergarten and 12th grade. So what we want to do is show teachers how to ask that question in a way that's appropriate to the age of their students and the books that they're teaching.
So why is literature, in your opinion, so important for the development of kids? Whether they're little, whether they're big, whether they're adults. Why is it so important?
Well, I'm going to get philosophical on you here.
Get philosophical.
It's because I think that the human mind and the human heart and the human soul are shaped like a story. And that the language that we speak at our deepest level is not the language of technology. It's the language of stories. And I would even say that the language of God is the language of stories. The Christian tradition, for example, is a story. Yes. God intervenes in history and gives the world a protagonist. And that protagonist has a goal. And that goal is obscured by conflict and obstacles. And he has to overcome the obstacles in order to solve the problem and answer the question of history. It's a story shape. And I think that as we learn to speak in the language of story, as we learn to listen to reality coming to us in the language of story, we become most fully human. Because I really do think that a story is, that the shape of a human soul is the shape of a story. That's the highest level answer I would give to that question.
I love that. I love that. I think it's interesting because I was talking to my 16-year-old as an avid reader, and I mean, she loves to read. And one of the things that she points out is as we were talking about a couple of the different series that she was reading at the time, she brought up that she had been with some friends and a choice had come up, and she was like, I kept thinking, what would Anne Shirley have done in this situation? And I said, why did you think that? And she's like, because it was a similar situation. And so I thought about her, and that kind of helped informed what I wanted to do. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It's almost like you've lived your own little life, lived through Anne. And then when she was faced with a similar thing, she was able to refer back to Anne of Green Gables to think about how she wanted to respond in the situation with, this couple set of friends.
Sure.
And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's talk your favorite stories for the different ages and for the different, the lack of a better term, grade levels, which
Sure.
I don't love that term because everybody's a little bit different.
They are, yeah. Well, we have done a lot of thinking about what the best stories are, and we would hardly be a curriculum development outfit worth its salt if we hadn't. Indeed, have published several books about it. We have one called Reading Roadmaps, which is a K through 12 scope and sequence manual that gives teachers in the classroom and also homeschool teachers a list of suggestions for what to have their 8th graders read and what to have their 7th graders read, and et cetera. And for each title, we've sort of summarized the general outlines of the story, the underlying conflict, a summary of the plot, some literary devices that the author uses to make his point, and some hints at an overarching theme, so that the teacher using those titles, sort of has a quick thumbnail sketch of what the shape of those stories are. And there's 250 titles in that book that are sort of
That's
annotated that way. But each grade level has a list of classics. What I would say is that those are our suggestions. That's the Center for Lit version of a publication there's millions of them all over the world. And I think the most important thing to do in that connection is find somebody that you trust and go get his annotated book list. And that's the best way to do that. I do have some personal favorites that I can list.
I would love to hear your personal favorites.
At the high school level, I would recommend Charles Dickens' Little Dorrit.
Really? Why Little Dorrit?
Little Dorrit is the best portrayal in fiction, in my view, of the essential difference between the economy of law and the economy of grace. The best historical fictional treatment of that distinction that I have ever read. And it's in Dickens' wonderful language with his wonderful characters, and he's the master of his craft. And I just think it's compelling on every page. Little Dorrit.
Little Dorrit.
Yep.
Excellent.
For juvenile readers, I am a huge fan of Gary D. Schmidt. Gary D. Schmidt, who is still living and working in the state of Michigan. And he publishes novels about the plight of teenagerhood and has written a ton of them. Well, not a ton, but maybe a dozen really, really quality stories. The Wednesday Wars is maybe one of his most famous. Could not recommend it highly enough. But my personal favorite from Gary D. Schmidt is called Straw into Gold. And it is an original take on the legend of Rumpelstiltskin.
Which we just started that for Read Aloud here in my house. Is that so? Yes.
You will not be sorry.
Yeah, we just finished the first chapter.
Oh,
so
wow. It's so good. And then I also have one recommendation as a picture book. There are a million great picture books out there, but my favorite is Patricia McLaughlin, and the title is All the Places to Love. All the places to love.
And I'll link all of these as well as the reading roadmap in the show notes for those of y'all listening. Great. So that you can.
Yeah. All the Places to Love is a family story. It's got wonderful oil paintings by the great Mike Wimmer, and I read it over and over again.
I love that.
I will say this though, the plot of the story, same as the plot of Gone with the Wind, same as the plot of Great Expectations, the same.
Same plot.
Yep.
I love that. Okay. Let's talk about testing. Are you a believer in having a child read a story and then take a test on it? Let's talk. What are your opinions there? What are your thoughts there?
Well, my opinions on that, unfortunately, are pretty strong. So I hope I don't alienate any listeners. I think that education, which is what the parent is after, is what the homeschool teacher is after, cannot be measured. And I think a lot of us would agree with that. They would say education can't be measured, but we often don't drill down to the implications of that statement. If it can't be measured, you shouldn't measure it. There isn't any good to come from measuring it. And so there's a profound sense in which the things we measure when we give somebody a test do not amount to education. We may be able to measure some important things with a test, but education isn't one of them. And so when it comes to testing, I think it's important that we identify what it is we're trying to measure and then address that thing separately from the education that we're trying to pass on to our students. Education, on the one hand, is, I would say, a state of the heart. It's a set of skills that allow us to feel and think and relate to the world and to each other in a self-conscious way. And that can't be measured. Turning in your work on time, that can be measured. Discipline, that can be measured, right? Vocabulary, that can be measured. The ability to construct a sentence with a capital letter at the beginning and a period at the end and have 5 appropriate sentences arranged: topic, support, clincher, that can be measured. And so what I think about testing is, as long as it's aimed at those things, great. Test all you want. But if what you're trying to do is quantify the education of a human heart, give it up, because it's going to be futile. And you should spend your time doing the things that will result in the cultivation of the human heart. And I believe those things are Socratic discussion of the great books, Socratic discussion of art and literature. So here's what I recommend. That's a philosophical conversation, I know, and it's more than you wanted. I'm sorry.
No, it is exactly what I wanted to hear. Like I want to hear like the heart of the matter, the real,
Here's what I recommend. I recommend that a good literature class, a good reading comprehension class, has a small number, a manageable number of assignments and tests designed to do two things. Number one, to create a paper trail, which may be necessary at some point to create a transcript or to prove to some outsider that something is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And also, the second thing that these assignments would be good for is to help inculcate those habits of discipline and grammar and rectitude, scholastic rectitude, that are important. And I think assignments and tests should be given for those two purposes alone. But they should be short, easily gradable, and above all else, they should not take up very much time. Because in the grand scheme of things, I think that the effort at cultivating a sensitive, self-aware human heart is by far the most important thing going on in a classroom. And that needs to take up 90% of the time that we're spending in the classroom. And if that's really separate and distinct from those things that measure discipline and get us a transcript, we should spend more of our time on the first and not the second. So, long story short, assignments are fine as long as they're aimed at the right goal and as long as they don't crowd out what's really important in your classroom, which is, hey, you see Huckleberry Finn trying to decide whether to turn his friend Jim in as a runaway slave? That's a question we all face at one point or another. How is that happening in your life right now? How is that happening in your heart? What are you learning about yourself reading this novel? Can we talk about that for a while? Forget the test. I'll give you an A. Don't worry about it. Let's talk about what's really important here.
Yeah.
We need to be doing that with the lion's share of our time.
I love that. Okay. What defines a classic in your opinion?
Oh, it's a great question.
Because would you say that there is good literature and there is poor literature?
Yes, I would.
And so let's dive into what separates the two.
Sure. So I can give you a simple definition that I think works for me, but I think it's probably more productive to ask the question and see how it plays out. For instance, some people say that a classic is a book that has been around forever, and we're still reading it. And so by that definition, Homer's Odyssey is a classic, and the Hunger Games are not, because one of them's been around for 2,000 years or whatever, and one of them hasn't even been around for 100 yet. But that definition doesn't work very well because Homer's Odyssey hasn't changed since the first day it was written down. But on the first day it was written down, it hadn't been around for very long.
So it wasn't a classic then.
It wasn't a classic then, or was it? A better definition would be to ask, why are we still reading Homer's Odyssey? Are we still reading Homer's Odyssey because junior high lit teachers won't quit assigning it to us? Or are we still reading Homer's Odyssey because it calls out to us in some universal way? Is it significant that everybody, every civilization, every era of history has looked at Homer's Odyssey and said the same thing? Now there is a great story. They've all said it. We should ask ourselves, why? Why is the testimony about Homer's Odyssey so unambiguously univocal down through the centuries? Maybe it's because some questions about what it means to be a human being, some universal questions, have been dealt with in universally compelling ways. And maybe that's the best definition of a classic. A story that treats universal human questions in universally compelling ways. If that's the definition, then Homer's Odyssey is a classic, and we can say that it was a classic from day one. And we might also say the same thing about J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, even though it hasn't been around 100 years yet. You could argue that it deals with universal human questions in a universally compelling way and may have a claim on classic status. It also leaves the question open for a book that just got written yesterday. I think Gary Schmidt's novels are classics of their genre. By that definition, certainly. And I would argue that 100 years from now, people will still be reading them going, wow,
This
it
is
hits
good.
me right where I live. So that's what I'd say. A story that deals with a universal human question in a universally compelling way.
Okay, so which leads us to the second question, which is how do you, and maybe this is answering the first question still, but how do you decipher good literature versus poor literature? Because I do hear moms say, oh, but my child only wants to read, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or they only want to read, this set of books, but I want them to read something better. What would you say to those parents?
Well, that question is different if you're talking about adults choosing books and if you're talking about assigning books to your fourth grader. And so I think the second version of that question is maybe more helpful. Diary of a Wimpy Kid versus Gary Schmidt, for example. Mm-hmm. And nobody is deceived about the fact that the Diary of a Wimpy Kid is not good literature in the same way that Gary Schmidt. We can just agree on that. That's not really a question about the difference between good and bad books. It's a question about how to handle curriculum questions with your fourth grader, right?
Right.
And that is a question that has a pretty clear answer, I think. What you do with your fourth grader is you say, I'll make you a deal. You can read a Diary of a Wimpy Kid for every good book that I assign you. And we'll go halfsies, because maybe reading a Diary of a Wimpy Kid will encourage your love of reading. There you are sitting with a book in front of you and you're enjoying the experience. And maybe that's all to the good. Take that good feeling and read Gary Schmidt with me, and we'll see what happens. Eventually, what's going to happen is that a Diary of a Wimpy Kid will fail to satisfy in the same way that Gary Schmidt will, especially if the kind of conversations we're having with our kids along the way have to do with universal questions and universal structural commonalities and the kinds of things that make a great book a great book. Pretty soon the kid's going to develop a taste for those things, and he will eventually, inevitably, leave the Wimpy Kid behind.
Yeah, I have found that to be true with my 16-year-old daughter. And one of her public school friends said, oh, I love this one book series. I'm not going to say what book series it was. It's not my favorite. And my daughter read that book series and she came home. She's like, I didn't know what to say to her, because she's like, that's my favorite series. And I asked her what else she had read, and that's all she had read. So that was her favorite. She's like, but Mom, it's terrible writing and it's not even that great of a story. But all that my friends from public school love that, but that's all they've read. But they've never read all of this other stuff. They've never read Jane Austen. They've never, and she's like, what do I say? And I said to her, I was like, well, you just listen to them and smile and appreciate that they're reading. But they've been eating Twinkies and you've just had this feast of delicious food and creme brulee and tasted all of these wonderful novels, so you can compare and see the difference. And she's like, oh, okay. Yeah. So I said, just meet them where they are.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the issue of distinguishing between good and bad is less important, or ought to be less important for us as teachers and parents than the issue of volume. I think it's really important to become a reader and to have reading be a way of life, a way of academic life. If you're reading, C.S. Lewis has this great line in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, where he's talking about the issue of literary criticism. And he says, my own eyes are not enough for me. I would see through those of others. He talks about how the human mind and heart and soul that is not widely read is liable to become trapped, to become imprisoned in a particular time and place. Right? If I wasn't widely read, I would be trapped in Northeast Washington in the 21st century. And that's all I would know, because my physical experience would be bounded. But when I read great literature, I explore the whole world. I explore all times in history. I hear voices not my own, wrestling with reality. And I develop a habit for that. And I realize that I must become a citizen of history and a citizen of the whole world. And Lewis says, my own eyes are not enough for me. I must see through those of others. That is a more important thing to do than to always be on the lookout for excluding bad books and welcoming good books.
Yeah.
Eventually, what's going to happen, if you are a citizen of the whole world and of all history, the bad books are going to fall away. Mm-hmm. There are reasons books go out of print, and it's because they're not that good.
Yeah.
And it sort of takes care of itself. So I think that's the more important question. How much am I reading? Am I seeing with the eyes of others?
What would you say for parents helping their children to come to love reading? How much should they be reading at the different ages with the children?
I don't know. I don't know if I'd put a number on that. I would say at the youngest ages, as much couch reading, read aloud time as you can cram in. It's more important than every other thing you're doing. It's at least in school. Mm-hmm. And you gotta learn how to add, and you gotta learn how to spell your name, but you got to learn how to read. That's the most important thing. And to have stories read to you all the time and to be always reading, and not necessarily, as I said, stories that are going to be good for you or stories that you're going to take a test on. Just stories, the great stories of the world written for your age group. It's a wonderful way to live. Dive into that and do as much of it as you can. So maybe the best answer to that question is one more.
I love it.
Read one more.
So let's talk about Center for Lit for a little bit. What resources do you offer to parents, particularly homeschooling parents? Because I know you offer stuff to teachers, classroom teachers, but what do you offer for homeschooling parents?
Well, our main product, if you want to call it that, our main little widget that we've been working on for the last 20 years is a class on how to lead a good discussion of a story. And the class is called Teaching the Classics. And it is essentially a DVD class for parents where I'm the teacher and my students are a room full of parents. And I say to the parents a couple of things. I say, I'm not assuming that you have any formal training or knowledge of literature, literary analysis, or lit teaching. So I want to take you from ground zero to a place where you can A, read literature yourself with enjoyment, and B, lead a class with your kids that will help them to do the same. And we proceed in that class by laying out the structural elements that all stories have in common, showing how they work together, and giving parents a list of discussion questions similar to the ones that I've mentioned today that show them how to lead kids into that same sort of understanding. It's very accessible and it's very approachable and very powerful, because what it does for parents is it puts a tool in their hands, a method in their hands for talking about books that really eventually replaces all the curriculum you're ever going to want to have. You'll be able to sit down and have a great conversation about anything.
And I think what's fascinating about that, so for me, even though I was a classroom teacher, I was a theater teacher, and so I didn't have to follow any specific methodology, but I found that when I started homeschooling, I'd get a curriculum, and it became really overwhelming to have, 6 curriculums. And eventually we moved to eclectic unschooling, but I still use curriculums here and there. What I love about the Teaching the Classics class is it's simple. There's not a lot of moving parts to try to figure out and am I doing this right? And I love the simplicity of it, that this is, and it could be repeated again and again and again.
Really what we're trying to do in Teaching the Classics is show you how to have a single Socratic discussion. And then once you learn how to have that discussion, you have the same discussion over and over with every book. And the familiarity of that simplicity, that repeatable procedure really works wonders.
I love that. Last thoughts or anything that you'd like to share that that didn't get asked, that you wish, oh man, I wish you would have asked this.
I would want to say one thing, and this doesn't necessarily benefit me at all. This is not an ad for anything. This is just something that I feel really led to repeat every time I get the chance. The parent is really the best teacher. And we know that this is true when it comes to passing on the family values to the next generation. No one's going to do that better than the parent, right? We know that that's true with, teaching a boy how to be a man, or teaching a girl how to be a woman, or we know it in those contexts. But I think it's also true in school, because of the relationship that exists between a parent and a child. Everything that is supposed to happen in school can happen more efficiently and more profoundly and more effectively in a parent-child relationship. And I say this with full knowledge that not all parents have formal training in academic disciplines, and not all parents are particularly inclined to classroom instruction. I know that. I've been in this game a long, long time, and I still say it. I double down. Your kids primarily need you to take them by the hand and lead them through what they need to learn in school. And I want to say a second thing about that, which is you're the perfect person to do it because of the advantages that you have as their parent, because of the relationship that's built into the universe there, because of the avenue to their minds and hearts that is built in. You can do that. You're the most effective one to do it. And you should never let insecurity about your lack of training or experience or inclination get in the way. If there's anything Center for Lit can do to encourage you along those lines, come to the website, give me a call, send me an email, whatever. But I really do think that's a truth about the world that doesn't get said enough.
It's true. And I think there's that insecurity, especially for those of us coming out of the system, looms in the back of our minds going, I'm not capable. I'm not, you're right. The truth is there's nobody more capable than the person who loves these children.
Absolutely
more
right.
than anybody else.
Absolutely right.
Adam, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience with us. For those of you interested in learning more about the Center for Lit, it's the centerforlit.com. We will have all of the references in the show notes so that you can check out all these wonderful things that Adam has introduced us to. Adam, thank you again for taking the time.
My pleasure, Janae. Great to be with you.
Thank you. And mamas and papas, grandmas and grandpas, you're doing better than you think you are, and you got this. We'll talk next week.
If you enjoyed this today, please like and subscribe. You could also join our private Facebook group at School to Homeschool, or sign up for our newsletter at www.schooltohomeschool. Have a great day.